One of the arch villains of this show, even probably prior to my time, I mean, Sam would still reference him, but if you did a heat map, these references are getting less and less as Lieberman faded from, acting on a political scene and doing horrible things. And yeah, he's another guy who it would be a mistake to spend this time eulogizing him in any way or, zeroing in on him as a father or whatever.
It's irrelevant.
Exactly. As a actor, as a political decision maker, as somebody who had a lot of influence in this country, a legacy of just horror, like medical debt, wars, all that stuff.
So for on that note, Joe Lieberman is dead. For the kids out there, as Matt alluded to, if you thought Joe Manchin was bad, Joe Lieberman filled a very similar role in the Senate. But he wasn't from a red state. He was from Connecticut. And as the man who is the most responsible in the Senate for killing the public option in the Affordable Care Act, as well as, by the way, the efforts to lower the Medicare eligibility age to 55 years old. He was the one in that Democratic conservative Democrat coalition who were working to water down the ACA, who was not from a conservative state. That's what also was notable about it. Like Evan Bayh was from Indiana. Max Baucus, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee at the time, was from Nebraska, and he was a big part. Montana. I was thinking of Ben Nelson. Ben Nelson was a big part of that too. He was from Nebraska. So, they were operating in a different kind of incentive structure, but Connecticut is the insurance capital of the country, and that includes health insurance. It is a massive industry there, and Joe Lieberman was a very effective bagman for or concierge or whatever you want to call it for those financial interests. And so it was also especially just from Obama's perspective, a stab in the back, because Obama campaigned for Lieberman in 2006. And then when Obama ran for president in 2008 and won the nomination, Lieberman turned around and campaigned for John McCain. So this was like just the kind of guy that Joe Lieberman was. He represented health insurers, he represented capital, and he is largely responsible for the amount of medical debt that people experience, the fact that we don't have a public option for healthcare, the fact that your healthcare is so expensive. That is the legacy of Joe Lieberman. Another piece of his legacy is the organization No Labels, which is still floating, fielding a third-party presidential candidate because Biden is too left-wing. That is their conceit. To the center of Biden and Trump. So they're still floating this, trying to make the country worse. That is his legacy too. And, any third party that enters, there's a potential to steal votes away from Biden. And who knows how things are going to go in that election. God help us with another Trump administration. But with all that said, Lieberman was also an unrepentant cheerleader for the Iraq War. And when I say unrepentant, this is an interview that Mehdi Hasan did in 2021 with Joe Lieberman, back when Mehdi Hasan was still on the Peacock network. And Lieberman refuses to acknowledge that the Iraq War, which is universally understood to be a horrific thing that the United States did.
A big fat mistake, as former President Trump said in a Republican debate.
Killed hundreds of thousands of people, destabilized the region, gave rise to groups like ISIS, all under false pretenses of Saddam Hussein developing a nuclear weapon or weapons of mass destruction, which were weapons of mass destruction, all proven to be false. But Joe Lieberman still thinks the war was a good thing.
Shifted on the Iraq war. Before I let you go, I got to ask you about Iraq. We just saw the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the end of the Afghan war. You have someone like Chris Murphy now representing Connecticut that you sat in for the Senate. He's very critical of the Iraq war. Have you disowned it? As recently as 2015, 2016, you were still saying you thought it was a good thing overall. It was a disaster. Are you willing to say tonight it was a disaster, you were wrong, you regret it, you apologize?
Well, sorry to disappoint you. I'm not. I mean, look, I was in the majority of members of the Senate Democratic Caucus who voted to authorize President Bush to go to war in Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein. After the war, after Saddam went into hiding until we caught him, the Bush administration made some big mistakes. And that went to the whole way in which they handled the Iraqi military, the Iraqi government. But my point of contention with a bunch of my fellow Democrats who turned against the war then was that we can't just cut funding for our troops in battle, which is what a couple of Democrats tried to do, and I was decisive vote against. We can't leave this battlefield in defeat because it'll until we stabilize the country. And frankly, we did. That actually happened.
But hold on. I have to ask this. We're out of time, but I have to jump in here. Thousands of Iraqis died. Innocent men, women, children, civilians in U.S. airstrikes, in massacres, in places like Haditha, Mahmudiyah, Balad. I asked John Bolton this same question almost exactly a year ago on this show. Does none of that bother you? Doesn't affect your conscience? Doesn't keep you up at night? The sheer level of suffering that we caused in Iraq?
Yeah, but of course it does. But the truth is that the people of Iraq were suffering terribly under Saddam Hussein, and so were the people of the region. I think the world is safer, as your headline up there from an earlier statement of mine, without him there. The cost of the war, both in lives and in money, American money, was way beyond what I ever anticipated. So I suppose if you could have foreseen that, I might have felt differently about it, but I'm not going to go back and try to correct.
I would hope that if you had foreseen thousands of deaths, you would have thought differently about it. We'll have to leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying it was worth it for us to get rid of the guy that we really just didn't like for all this time. Joe Lieberman, Democrat, then independent from Connecticut.
I appreciate maybe getting him on the record just to underline a point. Not just thousands of Iraqis, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis killed because of that invasion of Iraq. Between 250,000 and 500,000.
Based on a false pretense. But I mean, in 2011, let's pull this up here, Bradley, from, I found this, John Schwartz is a great account on Twitter and finds these great things here. When he was speaking to Arianna Huffington about this too, Joe Lieberman, said that, here we go. Arianna Huffington says, well, based on this completely unfounded assumption, I sincerely hope for the sake of the country that you do not become Secretary of Defense. This was after he said in this Morning Joe interview that I guess he was saying this in 2011, that Saddam was developing weapons of mass destruction. Saddam was developing chemical and biological weapons. This has been disproven many times over. And Arianna Huffington presses him on this, and she says, there is nothing in the report that proves anything that you have said. He said, I don't think you've read it, sweetheart.
Referring to this Dulfer report, which was commissioned by the U.S. government.
Right.
To kind of
justify the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
So, just a little bit. I mean,
I'll just underline from Wikipedia. The report acknowledged only a small stockpiles of chemical WMDs were found. The numbers being inadequate to pose a military significant threat. So that's from just a Wikipedia summary of that report. So
Joe Lieberman is dead. That is who he was. That is his legacy. I don't care who he was as a father, a grandfather, a gardener, an amateur. Backgammon player, whatever the hell he was. I care about him as a public servant. Yeah. And there are many, many people dead and their lives worse off because of his influence on the United States federal government.
His influence persists and still needs to be fought.
Yep. So there you go.
Oh, and the other thing is safer because of the invasion of Iraq and the quote unquote how Bush handled the Iraqi military. Yeah, ISIS, bro. We're safer. Just to name one outshoot of that conflict.
Exactly.